Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel, welcome to my workshop and welcome to this short technical video on the Mash 50 engine. 2 years ago I rebuilt the original engine of my Mash 50. It was showing signs of wear, it was making noises, and I made a video on the deinstallation, disassembly and reassembly with new parts on that. Link is up here. Only 500 kilometers after that engine rebuild, I still found the engine to be too noisy. I wasn't happy with what I've done and I didn't want to spend any more money on that engine. So I decided to install a new engine and also made a video on that. Link is up here. So on those two videos I got a lot of replies and a lot of questions asking about the oiling system, about when to do oil changes, how does the oiling system work, is there a filter in there. So I want to answer those questions, and I also want to get one misconception about this engine out of the way. So let's get started right away. So I think it's 30 years now that I'm working on these small 50cc 4-stroke engines, and when it comes to oil changes I change the oil every 2,500 kilometers. There's a real small amount of oil in there and the load on the oil and the mechanical load on these engines is fairly high. I've been working on the Honda engines with the horizontal cylinder and also these Lifan clones with the vertical cylinders. I'm going into detail on that later on. When you buy these engines new, there is a little sticker on here that gives you information on the break-in period, and it says to remove the oil strainer after I believe 300 kilometers and then do the first oil change. Now the oil strainer sits here below the pickup point of the oil pump, so when you need to do that, need to take the strainer out, and I'm going to show you in detail later on. What I usually do is I drain the oil after I warm up the engine, because warmer oil is easier to drain when it starts dripping and nothing comes out of the drain plug. What I typically do is put the bike on a side stand, because there's always a little bit of remaining oil in these engines, and when it's on the side stand all the engine oil runs to the flywheel side. And with a bike in this position, if you can do that, it can be difficult on Honda models because the foot pegs are mounted to the engine case itself. But over here we can now remove this side cover, the clutch cover, and by removing the clutch cover we have access to the oil pump and the strainer in there. So let's go over to the beds and have a closer look on the internals of these engines. So this is the old Mash 50 engine, and to get access to the oil strainer we have to remove this cover. Those are all 8mm bolts in there. So to break the seal you can push this little clutch lever and it usually comes off, and you have to be careful of the oil seal in here that goes over the splines of the Kickstarter. What you can do is put a little bit of tape over there, which I have at hand, and that prevents the seal from getting damaged. So there we are, and just remove it. Now I have already taken parts out of this engine, so what you see now is not entirely representative. There's still some oil leaking out. Usually you have the clutch over here and you have a larger sprocket over here. These are out, and there's a point I want to make that you see in a second. Because a lot of people think that this engine is based on the Honda CB50, but in reality it's not. It's completely based on the Honda design with the horizontal engine. And this angle over here where the cylinder sits in a Honda is exactly the same on this crankcase. The internals have changed a little bit, but I put this clutch and this large sprocket over here that drives the gearbox in my Honda SS50, and an engine that I'll show you in a second. All these parts, the internals, are interchangeable, and these Mash engines have a clutch with 2 plates, and I'm using that in a 72cc Honda because it holds up better than the original Honda single plate clutch. Anyway, let's wipe off some oil. Now it's really important that you don't damage this gasket over here, because you need to use it again. Officially you should replace it, but if you have a brand new bike it typically won't be that hard to keep it intact. Now if we remove this, I'm going to remove a little section of it. put it out of harm's way. As said, if you have a brand new engine, you can easily pull this out. But over here is the oil strainer. And let me get some needle nose pliers. And then you can pull the strainer out. So on a new bike, it's very common to see some metal particles in here. The bearings in these engines don't really have to break in because they're all roller ball bearings. Only thing that needs to wear in typically are the piston rings, and that's something that goes very fast. If you have a question about the break-in period, which is about 300 kilometers for these engines, you do that with the oil that comes from factory. What you should do is don't drive too slow, but especially don't rev it up too much, and you have to put some load on the engine every now and then. So when you get the engine up to operating temperature, and operating temperature means that you cannot touch this little cover on the side here, and if you cannot touch it with your hand, if you would start burn your hand, that means that the engine is at operating temperature. And with the oil on operating temperature, you can really put some load in there. Don't drive too fast, don't go up too high in gears. I would recommend not to exceed 5,000 RPM. And when it comes to top speed in highest gear, which is 4th gear in these engines, I would not go over 45 kilometers an hour. But it doesn't hurt the engine to put a little bit of load in there and to let it work and to accelerate. Just don't get too much engine speed in there, but most certainly don't be too careful and don't drive too slow. You really have to put some load on the piston rings to settle them correctly. Break-in oil change means get this out, you inspect it, you clean it out, and then you can put it back in, put a gasket back in place and put its cover back on, and then do its first oil change. This very first oil change after the break-in period is done after 300 kilometers. If you put new oil in, I would drive the bike to a total of 1500 kilometers, and from there on do your oil changes every 2,500 kilometers. Now on to the questions about the lubrication system. So here is the pickup. Let me pull this up a little bit more and show you in a little bit greater detail. So over here we have the oil pump, and it's driven directly on this side from the crankshaft. There's a plastic gear behind there. You can just see the last couple of teeth there. In Hondas there runs an axle through the block, and it's driven from the timing chain on the flywheel side. So here is the oil pickup. It goes through the oil pump, and this is where it comes out, and this is where the important part comes. And for that I need the clutch cover. Let's put the engine aside for a second. So over here is where the oil gets into the clutch cover. It's pumped through a line, a bore, inside here. Let me get a little bit closer up to the camera. Inside here, goes over here, and it comes out over here in the pressure plate for the clutch. That is where it enters the clutch, and that's where things get interesting. Let me put the engine back. So the oil gets into the clutch, and from the clutch it goes inside here through the crankshaft, where it lubricates the big end of the crankshaft. Now let me get the Honda block to show you some interesting things. From the clutch cover it enters the clutch over here through this little ball bearing, and inside here is a secondary filter, and that's something that a lot of people don't know. But when the oil gets in here, it drives of course at engine speed, at crankshaft speed, which can run up to 10,000 RPM, and this acts as a centrifuge. It's a centrifugal oil filter, so to speak, and the debris, the residue in the oil, collects in the corners over here. I'll see if I can remove this little clover leaf cover so we can have a look inside. Et voila, there is a little gasket over here, but you can do without that gasket, doesn't matter much. So this, in this little corners, is where the debris from the oil forms, and you get little black bumps. which is all the dirt that is filtered out of the oil, and it's really effective. I've seen Honda engines that have done 100,000 kilometers where these corners would be completely full. But anyway, oil is centrifuged inside here, and then it goes into the crankshaft. That's one. In these Honda engines, that oil outlet of the oil pump is down here. Sorry, it's down here in this corner. Oil pump sits behind here. So one part goes into the clutch cover, into the clutch housing, and another part splits right here. There's a little bore in front here at one of the head studs with a tiny little orifice, and then the oil goes to a channel up to here where it reaches this little cover for the camshaft, and it goes inside here and then into the camshaft. And the camshaft itself is hollow, and it has two little bores in the cams themselves which lubricate the entire cylinder head. And in case you're wondering why this cylinder isn't perfectly horizontal, it's tilted a little bit upwards, that's to drain the oil. The oil drain is via a channel at the bottom here. Does the camera see this? It's a bit hard to show on camera, but this is the channel over here that drains the oil back into the engine case. And meanwhile, this is starting to leak. I thought I drained it all. The oil channel split in these Mash engines is a little bit different. This is the corner. Let me rotate a little bit. This is the corner, the exit for the clutch cover, and you can see over here are internal bores going to the head studs. So it goes internally over here, and then it exactly follows the exact same route as in the Honda engines through this little camshaft cover into the camshaft itself. And that is how the oiling system of these Honda and Mash engines work. And we've also seen that the internals of these bikes are mostly the same. This of course is a modernized version, and something that Honda wouldn't do is use plastic gears for the oil pump. But anyway, that's what I wanted to show you and tell you about the lubrication and oil filtering system in these Mash 50/Lifan 139 FMB engines. One last question that I wanted to answer is about the life expectancy of those engines. So this is a 1970s Honda 50cc engine, which now is converted to 72cc and a 12-volt CDI system. But these internals with good maintenance will hold up to 100,000 kilometers. They really last long, these engines, and it's especially in the quality of the materials and production process that makes these engines last. These Lifan engines aren't bad at all, but the life expectancy is much lower. The crankshaft in this engine broke. There's too much play on the back end because I had a 72cc kit installed briefly, but I didn't like the engine characteristics, and I only drove 2,000 kilometers with it. But due to the high compression, that 72cc kit, so a larger bore kit, works with a standard cylinder head, but the end pressure, the compression is too high, and it really destroys the big end of the bearing. So that's one reason that this engine went kaput with 21,000 kilometers. If I would left it intact, I think these engines will last up to 25-30,000 kilometers, because apart from the extra wear that I applied by putting in the big bore kit, these engines are of a very different quality with regular maintenance, so oil changes every 2,500 kilometers. I think you can squeeze out 30,000 kilometers with these engines, but then again they are fairly cheap to replace. So when I rebuilt this engine, there was still a noise in there, but do a complete rebuild, if I had done it right the first time, that would have cost me more than to replace the entire engine. So that's lessons learned for me, lessons learned for you, but that is what you can squeeze out of it. And what's most important about these engines is that you warm up the oil correctly before you put any load on the engine. And as I said, what I typically do is put my hand on this side cover, and when I can't stand it with my bare hand anymore, when it gets too hot, that tells you that the oil is up to temperature. And also allow this engine to cool off. So if you're almost at your destination and the engine is really hot, it has to do a lot of work in these fairly heavy Mash 50 bikes. Allow the engine some time to cool off, so the last couple of kilometers slow down, and before you stop the engine, let it idle for a minute or two, so the heat can dissipate from the piston rings into the oil and into the cylinder. So that's what I have to tell about the oil and lubrication and oil change intervals of these engines. I hope you learned something. If you have any further questions, just let me know down below in the comment section. So for now, I would like to thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one. Bye!